Hi everyone, great to have you tuning in to this series of the Investor Talk. And in this episode, we have Julian here with us. To introduce, Julian has done a great deal of researches on marketplaces, digital platforms, and data-enabled businesses. He's also actively investing in startups emerging from these industries. So, Julian, perhaps you want to start off by sharing more about yourself and what sparked your interest in the startup industries?
Sure. So I'm a professor here at NUS teaching economics. As you mentioned, I've been researching on marketplaces since around 2000. So before they became really hot, before people were all talking about Facebook and Google and Amazon Marketplace and so on. Initially I was working on payment platforms, so like Visa and MasterCard, which have a very similar business model to some of the newer ones that we see now. And then that naturally led, as these marketplaces sort of took off, that naturally led me to do more and more research on some of these other ones. My research is actually both policy work, which is not so relevant to investing, although it is becoming more relevant as policymakers do start to crack down on some of the big marketplaces. But it's also strategy. So strategy meaning like how do these marketplaces choose prices, and how do they design their entry for the participants, how do they solve the chicken and egg problem, what are the cold start, the ways they can get around the cold start problem, and various market design problems. And of course those are all relevant for companies in this space because they face all these problems. And so I got into angel investing in sort of a couple of ways. One is I do a lot of research with my co-author, Andre Hajdu, who was at Harvard Business School. And he was involved with quite a number of venture capital firms and introduced me to various people. And we went to some conferences, and they're interested in our work because it's relevant for them to think about these marketplaces strategies. So that's sort of one way I was sort of getting involved. And then at the same time, one of his students, actually an ex-NUS student, who set up Funding Societies, so a Singapore company, he approached me to, he approached me to sort of give advice on right from the early stage of the setup of Funding Society. So I was kind of an informal advisor to them, and I saw the success. They've done very well and grew very quickly, and that sort of tweaked my interest in angel investing, like how quickly some of these companies can grow, particularly in the marketplace space. And so in the last couple of years, I've invested in various companies in the space, mostly through the US, but some locally as well.
Just now you mentioned one thing that I really want to ask you about, which is the chicken and egg problem, which I will come to that later, all right? Okay. So the next question that I have here for you would be, you have done a great deal of research relating to platform businesses. So share with us here, what are the trends in such platform businesses as of now? How these trends have been changing along the years.
Sure. So in the early days, it was really a grab for, I would say, consumer marketplaces. In Singapore, it was Carousel, right? And Chope and various marketplaces like that. And likewise internationally. And those are fairly broad marketplaces like Lazada and so on. Like they're basically covering huge numbers of sellers across many different, e-commerce sectors, right? More recently, and of course, eBay was the sort of the first poster child in that space, right? Like it covers so many different areas, and it's consumer focused. I think more recently, there's been a lot of development of much more specialized verticals. So like, a marketplace for metals or a marketplace for, particular service, right? If it's cleaning or whatever, right? So they've become much more specialized. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they have moved much more into business to business marketplaces. So these are ones that you wouldn't hear so much about because they're more relevant for business customers. But I think those are the ones that, they're doing particularly well. And then thirdly, the marketplaces have become more managed. So, if you think about eBay, it's like pretty hands-off. You have a transaction with a seller, they help you find the seller and maybe help you with the payment, but it's not very managed. And now there are a lot of marketplaces, particularly for services, like, if you're, so one that I'm thinking of is in the US is for elderly care. So they help students come into rest homes and give companionship for the elderly, right? Or do tasks for the elderly. And so managed in the sense that they're much more involved in the transaction. And they do a lot more of the screening and the facilitating, maybe adding some technology for the transaction to make it more seamless for the users. So there's a big shift towards, I think, more managed marketplaces rather than just, create a space where everyone can transact, but then you're not very much involved. So these are some of the trends. But I would say it's, I don't think people realize quite how many of these companies are emerging. Like you see it in the US first often. There are thousands and thousands, every year of new marketplaces, startups. And then you see them, a lot of these ideas filter out into Asia. Of course, also in China is another place where there's like thousands of original ones starting. And then you see many of the sort of better ideas filter out into Southeast Asia and other regions, into Europe as well. So it's a very active space, actually.
Right. And in fact, to me, I feel that to start platform businesses is really, there isn't really much capital involved, right? As long as you kind of have the business model and how you are going to gain traction onto your platform, I think that's a good starting point.
Yes and no. Like, yes, they're capital light, so you don't need to build a product and sell it. So in that sense, you don't need a huge amount of capital to get started. But no, in the sense that you have this chicken and egg problem, which means, to get users on board, you have to have users, but how do you get users with, you've got nothing to offer them. So often they do need quite a lot of capital to solve that problem. If you think about the example of Grab and Gojek, like, I think there are a bunch of startups in Singapore that tried to compete with Grab, but it's very hard to get, the riders without the drivers and the drivers without the riders. And if you have a whole war chest of capital like Gojek did, they can come in and offer subsidized rides initially to, get people using it and then attract drivers. So for some of these marketplaces, you do actually need quite a lot of capital to get started. If you're not the first entrant and you don't have a clever way to get users on board for free.
Right. What you just mentioned brings me to the next question. Startups usually starts with like no or very low capital, especially for student startups. So to attract investors, they often have to have gained at least some traction, like what you mentioned earlier on. So here comes the chicken and egg problem of building credibilities, having a prototype to get potential users interested. So how do you design a go-to-market strategy in such scenario? And what would you actually recommend startup to focus on in the initial phase?
So a couple of ideas here. So one would be, they can keep their focus very narrow initially. So of course, this doesn't apply to every example, but in some examples, if they can keep their focus very narrow, and if you think about marketplaces, they often try to attract like sellers across a broad range of categories and so on, and you just need so much capital to do that. But if they just tag on a very narrow segment of users and solve one particular use case, right, then they've made the problem a lot smaller initially, and maybe they don't need a whole lot of users on each side to provide that service for this particular problem. And so narrowing down the problem into a smaller problem is one way to reduce the capital requirements, right? Then the second thing is, you're not going to be able to raise funds say for a marketplace until you have proven, like, at least for this narrow area, there's interest in what you're doing, right? You've actually started to solve the chicken and egg problem. It's typically very hard to raise funds until you get some traction, right? In for these types of businesses. So this is where you really have to, you have to rely on your own capital or your friends and family, right, to get going. Or maybe in NUS case, you can rely on NUS, because you can't expect outside investors to come in until you've sort of got over that initial chicken and egg problem. And I think that's also good in a way. Like it basically forces you to really have commitment and conviction about what you're doing, right? That you're willing to put your own money and your friends' money and your associates' money into the business, right? Before you take outside money. I think that's just a reality for these types of businesses. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. It's either you start with having some capitals to gain the traction, or if you say like if you don't have capital, then you have to really put in the hard work, right?
You have to bootstrap it. You have to put in the hard work. You have to convince your friends or university group to give you some money based on that hard work, and get the word out about your product or service, right? Like you have to do all the word of mouth marketing. You don't have money to spend on marketing, so you have to get press release or do some clever trick to get the marketing.
Right. I totally understand what you are saying here, because for me, right, I'm actually working on a startup with a group of a team. So our startup is called Saver, and at the initial phase, it was really reaching out to organizations, schools for feature, and also merchants. But that's the interesting part of starting something.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what we call hustle, right? That's what we call hustle.
Yes.
And I think investors want to see the hustle, right? If people just think they have an idea and then people are going to put lots of money and they don't have to do any work, then I don't think it works quite like that.
Right. This startup scene is becoming so something that everyone wants to be their own boss. And how do you think startups can actually measure differentiation among their competitors?
So, differentiation, the way I think about it is the startup should be looking at some unique, fresh way in which they're approaching the problem, right? It may be that someone else is already solving this problem.
Right.
First of all, there has to be a real problem, right? A real user problem or customer problem. There's something that's not perfect about the way things currently are. And then you have a fresh way of solving it. Maybe it's you're focusing on a different customer group, or you're going to use more technology or data to solve the same problem, or maybe you're actually doing something in a different business model. So marketplace is essentially like a different business model. So people were previously they were buying the stuff and selling it, and now you're going to create a marketplace between the buyers and sellers. So it has to be something fresh and different from what other people are doing, and hopefully better, but that remains to be worked out, right? But as long as I don't think if you're just doing the same thing as what everyone else is doing without any fresh way of looking at the problem, I don't think those types of startups, they can do well. Of course, you could be just an excellent team and you execute really well, but I tend to stay away from investing in those. I'm looking for something unique and different from what currently exists. Because otherwise, yes, you can do better. You can actually do the same thing as what someone else is doing. You come in later and you just do it better. But I'm probably not best placed to determine whether, you can do that or not. You may think you're better than everyone else, but everyone's going to say that.
Right. Definitely.
I tend to look for those businesses where those ideas where the founders have really a fresh take on the same problem. But that's my style of investing.
What are the three most important factors that you actually look out in startups that you are willing to, invest your time and effort in?
Right. So I would start with the market, right?
Okay.
I mean, this is nothing new here. I think these factors are well known, but I would always start with, they must be tackling a big problem, essentially, right? If it's a very small problem, that's fine. It's probably useful for them to do that. They can create a business out of it, but it's not probably going to be a venture-backed business. So they must be tackling a big problem, meaning there's a big potential market. It doesn't have to be that the market is currently very big. Like when Airbnb started out, or even Uber, right? When people looked at that, most venture capitalists passed because they didn't think the market was very big that they were addressing.
Right.
But they're actually, if you think about the problem they're solving, which is finding accommodation when you're traveling, that's a big problem, right? And they just have a very different way of looking at it. So that's the first thing, big market. I guess the second factor would be the team, right? Like, is this the right team for that problem? Do they have the right backgrounds and skills, hopefully complementary skills to tackle that problem? And then the third one, which I don't think everyone has, but for me, it's sort of more of a focus, which is if they succeed on their vision, so they have this big vision of what they're going to do. If they succeed, will they have built a moat around that business? Will they be able to have a moat around that business? Or is it a business, if they succeed, everyone else will want to do the same thing and they'll be competing? There's no real defensibility. So the nice thing about marketplace businesses, they're very hard to start, very hard to do well in, but if you succeed, and if they have the right characteristics, not all marketplaces have these characteristics, but that's where I'm hopefully have some expertise. If they have certain characteristics, they tend to be winner takes all or winner takes most. So the firm that does succeed will have a very strong moat and be protected against competition. And so, these are the three factors I look for.
Right. So just now you mentioned quite a lot about Airbnb. You also mentioned about eBay. So I mean, at the start, I understand that the challenge for startup is able to gain user probably isn't the hardest thing. It is perhaps the retention period, which means that how long are people going to continue using a platform, right? And for example, like what you mentioned, Airbnb, eBay, and Grab, they are able to scale because they actually found the right market, right? So I would say that getting their company, their startup to scale is another challenge altogether. And to you, what are the top 3 factors of a startup being able to scale?
Okay. I mean, I would say for marketplaces, they have the nice feature that to scale up, once they get the product market fit, they're providing the service that users actually want, then the scaling can be quite exponential and sort of automatic, which comes from the network effects, because the more initially they solve that chicken and egg problem, they get some sellers, they get some buyers, but then as they get more of these on each side, that attracts more on the other side, right? So they have a few more sellers, that makes them have more products to offer, so more buyers come in, and so on and so forth. So the scalability of these types of businesses is the other attraction, which is they tend to be highly scalable without without bottlenecks or constraints, right? They don't have to add new new infrastructure or new build a bigger product or version 2.0 to deal with scalability. So I think the advice for marketplaces may be a bit different from, say, a product company, right, or a deep tech company, where the scalability is a whole different kettle of fish. Having said that, it's still, I mean, a lot of these companies lose money for a long time, as we know, right?
Yes.
And I think I have some theories as to which types of marketplaces are more profitable and which ones do tend to, continue to lose money. So for those ones which like Grab, which or food delivery platforms, which tend to have bad unit economics, scalability then comes into how much funding can you generate to continue to subsidize the business, right? Until you get to such a big scale and maybe the competition settles down a little bit that you can actually start making profits. So I think for those companies, the key factor is like getting capital, right? Which is continuing to get capital, which has to do with, convincing investors that one day they're going to get it all back, right? When they get to a huge scale. So that's also a little bit different from a typical company, I think. And then, of course, the third thing for scalability, which I'm not an expert on, but I think everyone realizes is like the scaling inside the business, right? Like hugely important is the internal dynamics of the team, and going from having a small team where everyone knows each other to having an enterprise, right? It's very challenging for many founders, and they have to bring in the right people and trust the right people, and that's a whole set of problems that I think every company would face when scaling.
All right, I have a last question for you right here. So, what was it that interests you to come on board NAV Angel Venture?
I would say the first thing is I wanted to learn more about the local ecosystem. So I'm very much like tied into the US, Silicon Valley, startup scene and angel investing. I do belong to an angel group here for a year, and I talked to some VCs here, but I don't know the ecosystem so well. And I was approached to join. I'm an NUS faculty. I do a lot of angel investing. It was perfect timing for me because I'd really like to get more involved in the local scene and try and help to transfer some of that knowledge and experience I got from Silicon Valley investing into the local scene. I know things here work a little bit differently, but I think we're catching up pretty fast. And there's a lot of opportunities, compared to Silicon Valley where things are quite mature, and valuations are very high. So I'm very interested to sort of apply it to the local scene.
All right. Okay. All right. We have come to the end of this session today. So if anyone have any more follow-up questions, feel free to send in your question to our email here, and do connect to Julian on LinkedIn and reach out to him. So thank you, Julian, once again for taking time off your busy schedule, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.